Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is David Ransom and I'm one of the principal investigators on the Crash Conspiracy and Democracy project. It's a great pleasure to welcome Stef Aupers, who's the first of a series of visiting fellows that we have coming to the project. I think we have 17 coming over the next 2 years, so there's going to be lots of exciting lectures. Everyone who comes will give a talk about their work as well as being involved in our other activities. Before I say a little bit more about Stef, just a couple of things. The first, we're being filmed. Apparently everyone has to agree that so we can disseminate their image.
I disagree.
Online. You've just been filmed saying that. So we can't do it. Okay? So if you don't want to, you have to hide your face or something. The second thing is that the main event we're running this term is a film season at the Picture House, which is going to be starting on the 11th of February. 5 films. Classic conspiracy theory films, starting with The Manchurian Candidate. Each film will have a talk about the political context and so on. Everyone's going to be welcome. We'll be publicising it more nearer the time. Okay, so Stef is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and he has wide-ranging research interests and wide-ranging publications, broadly speaking on the area of post-Christian spirituality in very modern settings where sacredness and spirituality plays out in modern economies, modern societies, through the IT revolution and so on. And conspiracy theories is one feature of this work. Conspiracy theories which can be understood both as very modern, secular expressions of doubt, but also as rather esoteric, potentially even sacred ideas about the truth. And Stef's going to be talking about where conspiracies fall between these two things. The only other thing to say is it's a particular pleasure to have him here because those who've been to our events already will know there's sometimes a tendency for these talks and these ideas to focus on the North American context, and Stef's done a big empirical study of conspiracy culture in the Netherlands, in Dutch politics and society, so we'll be looking at this in a location that doesn't often get associated with. Stef will talk, then one of our resident fellows, Alfred Moore, will give a brief response. We'll have a discussion, we'll move outside for drinks. That's the way it goes. Okay, welcome, Stef.
Thank you very much for the introduction. First of all, I'm really honored to be here and to be invited by Crash in general, and of course the Conspiracy and Democracy project. I'm really honored about that, and I'm looking forward for these meetings that we're having and the film night, so to speak. So thank you very much for that. So, referring to a little bit what you were saying, we haven't done the empirical research completely. We're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of it. So a lot of what I will be talking about is basically based on the sort of first analysis, and we do a lot of we use a lot of different methods here. We analyze films. I mean, we have a project on which we analyze about 600 movies on conspiracy theory. We have qualitative and ethnographic research, and Jaron, who's sitting over there, who's the PhD student of the project. So when I will be talking about I, in many cases I will mean we. So he's doing a lot of the qualitative ethnographic research, and another aspect of the research is that we do surveys. Like, that's where I want to start just a little bit here. What we do obviously is these are just the descriptive numbers, and obviously what we try to do in many cases is try to find different correlations. So we are obviously very much interested in the demographics, the relations between belief in conspiracy theories and sort of social backgrounds, gender, of course, education, political preferences, but also sentiments of enemy, of meaninglessness, etc., etc. So this is one element of the project. So I thought, well, let's begin with this little graph here, because it obviously gives an indication of, say, the sort of popularity of conspiracy culture, conspiracy theories here. So it's just an indication. This is indeed a survey done in the Netherlands amongst about 1,153 respondents. So it gives an indication here. Like some people say that the American government is responsible for the 9/11 attacks, obviously a very well-known conspiracy theory, is about 70.4 people saying they are probably not right. So that means obviously that about 30% is believing this or thinks it's plausible. That's the whole issue with this chart. Similar things can be said about these different things. I mean, I think most arrestingly is the conspiracy about Princess Diana. I mean, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories about her accident in 1997. So here you see that about 50% has all kinds of ideas that it is true that there's a conspiracy or that it's plausible. Okay, and some people will say, well, they are probably right, and others will say they are absolutely right. Another one is this: a small elite of powerful people is secretly pursuing the establishment of a new order, which is, you'll find this in all kinds of varieties, in all kinds of manifestations. I mean, some, and this is one element of my talk, some will hinge more towards the sort of social scientific theories about globalization, whereas others will, like those of David Icke, for instance, will be very much about global shape-shifting reptilians that are basically governing the world, right? So these are very manifestations. So we don't know exactly what people think when they answer this question, but it's quite a large percentages of people who think it's at least plausible, so to say. So this, that said, I mean, I want to start off with what I think is very important if you're talking about conspiracy theories. Because if you're talking about conspiracy theories, obviously, and I think actually most of the researchers here will have experienced that, all people will ask you all the time, so are they in general, are they false or are they true? Is it plausible or is it not? Well, actually, this is a sort of approach, and I know the Conspiracy and Democracy Project is not so much interested in that, answering that question, so that aligns very much with our approach here, but it is a very salient approach and a very important, not only in media but also in academia, that people will try to answer the question whether or not it's true, it in general. So the question always pops up: how rational or irrational are these theories about a group of people secretly conspiring against the masses? Those who are called conspiracy theorists, and I chose that formulation on purpose because, very much based on my talk, it will be quite difficult to find out what a conspiracy theorist actually is. But those who are called conspiracy theorists would argue that incidents like those of Watergate in 1972, the Iran-Contra affair in 1986, or the recent surveillance activities of the NSA feed the plausibility and confirm the rationality of conspiracy theories. And what to think of the debate about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. There's a big debate about that. The new manual for psychologists and psychiatrists, that is. Under influence of the medical industry, it stretches very much the definitions of what is pathological and what is not, what is deviant and what is not. The business of selling Ritalin, Xeroxat, Prozac and other pharmaceuticals is booming ever since, is the idea. Based on events like these, those who are called conspiracy theorists defend their habitus of suspicion, since they are indeed out there to get us, is the idea here. Or, as Mulder would say in the X-Files, no matter how paranoid you can never be paranoid enough. Or in the words of Charles Pignon, who was, if I'm correct, here last October of the last year, he argued, if you are not a conspiracy theorist, then you're an idiot. Which is a quite straightforward way of saying these types of things, of defending indeed the plausibility and rationality of conspiracy theories. And indeed it would at least be wise to take a more agnostic stance. Personally, I don't believe that media images of the moon landing in 1969 are fake and constructed by Stanley Kubrick in Hollywood. And actually, I don't believe personally that George W. Bush, Hillary Clinton and Queen Elizabeth are in fact alien shape-shifting reptilians trying to create a new world order. like I referred to before. But I'm not sure. And more than that, I distrust anyone knowing for sure that these assertions are false. So, and yet, despite the possible plausibility of conspiracy theories, the image of conspiracy theories as deluded and irrational remains quite strong in culture, media, and academia. And one of the elements of our research is indeed that we try to find out what the sort of moral judgment is, what the sort of moral label is that you find in both academia and in media. I'll get back to that later. Calling someone a conspiracy theorist is still an excellent way to dismiss one's argument as irrational and exclude the speaker from public debate. In academia, this frame of irrationality is constructed in different ways. First of all, there's the psychoanalytical reading. Sigmund Freud considered paranoid thinking a symptom of repressed and subliminal homosexuality, and basically argued that the enemy is in fact not really out there, but is in fact really in there, in the minds and the subconsciousness of these clients, of these people that he was talking with. Academics like Richard Hofstadter and Daniel Pipes dropped the particular thesis about homosexuality, but maintained the psychoanalytical concept of paranoia to psychologize, or rather pathologize, their politics and dismiss their truth claims. Conspiracy theories are furthermore considered to be the opposite of science, of scientific method, of scientific rules and procedures. Basically, it is just another religion, which is really tight. It's not science, and if it's not science, it's belief, it's faith, and it's religion. This is the sort of logic that you'll find in these discourses. It's just another religion full of improvable beliefs with nothing but faith to sustain them. This stance is basically the heritage of Karl Popper, you could say. He argued that conspiracy theory about society is an outdated remnant from the past, a secularized form of superstition. Its illusionary assertions, he added, form the very opposite, and I quote, the very opposite of the true aim of the social sciences. Likewise, contemporary academics point to the dangers of societies, institutions, politics, and democracy. It is, Daniel Pipes contends, a poisonous discourse that encourages a vortex of illusions and superstitions. Others consider it an epidemic or a plague, and such academic accounts, you could say, clearly indicate moral panic about the dangers that conspiracy theory forms for society. And it's tempting to say that these critics of conspiracy theories develop their own conspiracy theories about conspiracy theories. Scholars, in short, take sides in the academic debate about the rationality of conspiracy theories, the empirical soundness of such claims, and hence their social acceptance. Some, like Jack Bratich or David Cody and Peter Knight, defend to a certain extent the rationality of conspiracy theorists and the plausibilities of their theories. Others just openly condemn conspiracy theories as utterly irrational, as paranoia, bad science, or religious belief. You always find these three elements to construct the image of the conspiracy theorists as the other of modernity, as the other of the scientific worldview. Instead of taking sides in the debate between academics and conspiracy theorists, I propose to study this heated debate as a cultural conflict over true knowledge. Being cultural sociologists, we are not basically interested in determining what is really true, what is really good, and what is really beautiful. We're more interested in how people define the situation. We're more interested in what people believe is true, is just, and is beautiful. That's our empirical reality. That is basically what we study as cultural sociologists. This and the ways such beliefs, such assumptions provide collective meaning and motivate social conflict. In this particular case that we will be dealing here with, we approach the competing and conflicting truth claims of academics and conspiracy theorists as a discursive struggle for epistemic authority, knowledge and certainty. The main assumption in our research project on conspiracy culture is basically that it is not so much, and it should not be regarded as an isolated cultural or social phenomenon. It is always codified. It's part of a network, a social network, and it is hence always codified by interactions with science, media, and other social groups claiming rationality, which to a certain extent has already been demonstrated. Conspiracy culture, in other words, should be situated in a broader field of knowledge production. In this presentation, I will try to demonstrate that the images of conspiracy theories as either religious or highly rational are problematic. They are motivated by social-political interests. They are a mutual form of othering, so to speak, and hence obscure the complexity of conspiracy discourses and their meanings. Conspiracy theory should not be reduced to good science, as conspiracy thinkers would have it, or bad religion, as many academics would have it. Its discourse rather represents a hybrid, is my argument, of both elements, of both domains, which explains much of its cultural appeal, is the additional conclusion. So, this brings me to the sort of first part of the analysis. Like I said, a common trope among the critics is that it's bad science and that it should considered religious belief. Unlike real scientists, their argument goes, they are not so much interested in falsifying, but always verifying theories, and hence they confuse fact and fiction, reality and fantasy. As Michael Barkoun argues, no matter how much evidence their adherents accumulate, belief in conspiracy theory ultimately becomes a matter of faith. More than that, conspiracy theories embody a thoroughly outdated worldview, says Keeley. All conspiracy theorists are thus considered religious believers. They are othered and excluded as the obscure counterpart of modern scientific reason. This image, and like I said before, as cultural sociologists, we study discourses and we study the things that people say, that they argue, their self-understanding, so to speak. And basically, this is the sort of work that has not very much been done within the studies of conspiracy theorists or conspiracy culture. The image of conspiracy theorists themselves completely contradicts the self-understanding of virtually all conspiracy theories in our study. Ironically, they all debunk the label conspiracy theorists with its connotation of irrationality and religious belief. They are collectively, as individuals, they are collectively stating, I am not a conspiracy theorist. Which indeed indicates, in a quite indirect sense, that this is really a moral label. More than that, they consider themselves as secular skeptics and critical thinkers, since they are, in their own words, skeptic by nature. They dare to think differently, think out of the box, and, as one respondent argues, put question marks over nearly everything. So this, to a certain extent, very much aligns with a lot of the sort of classical skepticism, that you are not so much making claims about reality, but you are very critical, and in the end you don't take a position, but you're just trying to tease out what is going on and try to deconstruct the ideas of other people in the field. So based on these characteristics, they explicitly distinguish themselves from conventional scholars and scientists, they say. They see themselves as more scientific even than established scientists who are bound up, they argue, with the power interests of institutions and are guided by conventional paradigms, scientific rules, procedures, and dogmas such as dualism, reductionism, or materialism. More than that, in a veritable Foucauldian fashion, they make assumptions about the knowledge-power nexus here. They express, according to Timothy Malley, radical doubt about how knowledge is produced and about the authority of those who produce it. Respondents then understand themselves as purifying science, basically. They allegedly embody the true spirit of scientific inquiry that has been lost within contemporary scientific institutions. And that's based on secular skepticism and fundamental doubt about every truth claim, including their own. And obviously I'm not saying here whether or not this is actually true, but this is the discourse we are studying. From this perspective, it's fascinating to see that conspiracy theorists, or as they are called, are not only skeptical about science, but also about other critical people in the milieu. The adage, "I am not a conspiracy theorist," has therefore two functions. On the one hand, it is used to defend oneself against the moral changes of conventional scientists and debunk the connotations of irrational, deluded, and belief. On the other hand, however, the same critical rhetoric of conventional scientists is used to distinguish oneself from irrational, deluded others within the milieu. They are not conspiracy theorists. Other people are, is the argument. Ironically, such individual claims of rationality are expressed by all respondents in our sample, and hence structure the social field of knowledge production in which they operate. Radical skepticism, we could say, about epistemological foundations and methodological rules has, of course, always been an intricate part of the modern scientific enterprise, since at least the 16th century, and has haunted its legitimation ever since. It formed, as Stefan Toulmin would argue, the hidden agenda of modernity. Particularly through the philosophy of knowledge developed by Nietzsche and many, many others, skepticism found a radical expression in postmodernism over the last decades. Postmodernists prophesied the end of the grand narrative of science. Well, that sounds quite good. I mean, shall I turn this into a song? Postmodernists prophesied the end of the grand narratives, of course, the grand narratives of science, as Lyotard would have it, and its ambitions to be a mirror of nature, as Richard Rorty would have it. Ultimately, truth claims were social constructs that were the product of ideological interests, conflicts, and power. Scientific knowledge was no longer considered, hence, superior to other forms of knowledge, since it was deconstructed as just one cultural discourse among many other language games, vocabularies, or even a self-referential hyperreality with no relation to authentic reality whatsoever, as Jean Baudrillard would have it. This radical delegitimation of objective scientific knowledge has not only, as for instance Anthony Giddens argues, penetrated the ivory towers of the academic world in philosophy of science, constructivist account of knowledge, and postmodern theory. It has increasingly permeated everyday life. This skepsis, relativism, and irony towards scientific knowledge is definitely expressed in the discourse of conspiracy theorists. As one respondent argued about science, to look at something scientifically is to look at it in a particular way. It's never impartial, so there is no absolute truth. Conspiracy theories from this perspective cannot easily be reduced to bad science or belief from on a discursive level. Quite the contrary, they convey a radical doubt about every truth claim. So this brings me to the second argument here within this whole story, this whole analysis of conspiracy theory as secular skepticism, and that this is the pop sociology of conspiracy theories, because basically they are not only, in a sense, the skeptics, or are not presenting themselves only as skeptics. Basically, they are presenting themselves to a certain extent as sociologists, and maybe lay sociologists, but very much involved in the sociological discourse. Peter Knight, to begin with, argued convincingly, as far as I'm concerned, that conspiracies have always existed but substantially transformed over the last decade. I mean, actually, I think this is still a sort of empirical matter here, because I would be very interested in the type of research that demonstrate that there is indeed a substantial shift from one paranoid or conspiracy narrative towards another. But his argument is that whereas traditional theories are about a real or an imagined exotic other outside society, like Jews, Muslims, or communists, Think about the 1950s and the witch hunt for communism, of course. Contemporary theories are generally about our own modern institutions. Ideotypically, this modern type is diametrically opposed to the traditional type, since its theories are basically about the enemy within, the sinister, unknown and malicious forces that operate within the machineries of scientific laboratories, medical industries, and modern corporations and the state. Conspiracy theories, Timothy Mellier rightly stated in this respect, are a somewhat nervous, dramatic claims about modern forms of social control. And just to begin with, as a first step in this part of the analysis, you can say at a minimum that social scientists and conspiracy theorists share the same object of analysis. This object is modern society. They are all interested in modern society. And like all sociologists, they are starting from the assumption that individuals do not have full agency. They are basically controlled by social forces. They are socialized in a particular worldview and internalize, establish norms and values. Basically, this is the core of the sociology of knowledge, for instance. If you take this example or this influential book of The Social Construction of Reality, written by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, of course. They emphasize that reality as we experience it has, of course, emerged from subjective intentions and social interactions, but once it is established, it becomes a reified social structure that alienates the individual citizen. Man, they argue, is imprisoned in the objective reality of his society. Likewise, conspiracy theorists argue that everything is staged and everything is socially constructed. Individuals are dealing with an alienating world that is no longer of their own making. Jody Dean, from this perspective, has made the point that conspiracy theories about aliens governing the world and are a literal expression of this analysis of alienation in society. Her argument would be, her interpretation would be indeed that these stories of David Icke about our world leaders being shape-shifting alien reptilians is a literal expression of the fact that we as citizens are alienated from our world leaders, so to speak. We are, we may say, living in an alien nation. Be that as it may, some of the metaphors used in sociology show a strong affinity with those expressed in conspiracy culture. Images of society like an iron cage of bureaucratic rules, by Max Weber, a surveying panopticon, Michel Foucault, or an omnipresent technocracy, by Theodore Roszak, all metaphors emphasize overpowering social systems that threaten basically human values and individual freedom. Such sociological notions about modern society indicate what Timothy Mellier calls agency panic, which is at the same time at the heart of conspiracy theory. He argues by agency panic, I mean the intense anxiety about an apparent loss of autonomy or self-control. The conviction that one's actions are controlled by someone else, that one has been constructed, here's the term again, by powerful external agents. And yet there are, of course, as always, differences between the assumptions made by conspiracy theorists and social scientists. For one, social constructivists point out the staged and alienating dimension of social structure, but they deny any intentionality to a certain extent. There is no, from this perspective, no particular interest or power group or power involved. Social systems from this perspective are basically the unforeseen and sometimes undesired and unwanted side effect of human actions. This is quite different with conspiracy theories, we may argue, and definitely this is the case. By definition, they point out the secret agenda of powerful social groups operating within modern society and its institutions. We find this, for instance, in the grand theories of figures like David Icke, Alex Jones, or, for instance, the Zeitgeist movement. In the first documentary of the latter movement, of the Zeitgeist movement, they made various documentaries, it is stated, for instance, the last thing, and I quote, the last thing the power establishment wants is a conscious, informed public capable of critical thinking. It is in their interest to keep you in a distracted, naive bubble, and they're doing a damn good job. Although statements such as these cannot easily be aligned with social constructivism again, it does show a strong affinity with another respectable tradition in the social sciences, which is critical theory. Theories from Herbert Marcuse, as developed in One-Dimensional Man, for instance, or assumptions made in the dialectics of enlightenment of Horkheimer and Adorno, theorized very much about the emergence and effects of a culture industry, are very good examples. They claim that modern citizens are indeed repressed by a highly rationalized system, but add to the sort of Marxist approach that the machineries of capitalism do not only exploit producers or laborers, but basically they also exploit the consumers through commodity fetishism. The culture industry of radio, film and advertising enter the private sphere, and increasingly they colonize the personal life world. As Horkheimer and Adorno would have it, and I quote, "The stronger the positions of the culture industry become, the more it can deal with consumers' needs, producing them, controlling them." And obviously at the heart of these type of neo-Marxist critical theories is this whole concept of false consciousness. Not unlike the statement of the Zeitgeist movement I was referring to before about keeping citizens in a distracted, naive bubble, critical theorists hold that personal freedom is a well-crafted illusion that is only of interest to modern capitalism. It is basically a commodified enchantment, a mass-produced form of pseudo-individualism that obscures basically the hegemony of capitalism, the material gains it strives for, and the radical social control it exerts and it holds over individuals. We may think we are free, but in fact we are not, is the sort of blunt message here. Quite the contrary, even our senses and private emotions are no longer to be trusted. What we think, feel, smell or see may be an illusion created by modern institutions. So we can ask at this point in the text, how different is this from sort of critical theory, these assumptions here, from the statements of David Icke? He talks a lot about brainwashing, mind control, mass hypnosis through media, film and television, and argues, you think your eyes are seeing what they're seeing? Think again. The affinity between the allegedly rational critical theory and irrational conspiracy theory, finally, is not limited to its social analysis. Both discourses are a straightforward attempt to wake up alienated citizens, so to speak. They aim to set them free by showing the real, awful truth behind modern appearances and the machineries of modernity. The assumption nothing is what it seems, so typical for all conspiracy theories, is also part and parcel of the discourse of critical theory, you might say. All in all, I think the conclusion is that both discourses of conspiracy theorists and critical theory, so radically separated in academia and public debate, in fact show what Weber calls an elective affinity. Critical theory is a paranoid form of sociology, you might say, and vice versa. Allegedly paranoid statements about social systems and mind control may be understood as sociological discourses. Both discourses, Parker argued, claim to uncover supposedly hidden plots or machineries which have caused a particular state of affairs or events to take place. Finally, the important sociological question here remains how and why such strong moral dichotomies between both are constructed. And here I get back to the sort of idea of locating conspiracy theories in a wider field of knowledge contestation. More in particular, it raises the question why conspiracy theories are so often considered as irrational, deluded or religious by academics. Why they are demonized as the other of modern academic reason, so to speak. Ironically, I think it may now be concluded that it's exactly the elective affinity, which is still a hypothesis, right? We're working on this. So, it is the elective affinity between conspiracy theory and social theories, why they are othered and excluded from the public debate. So they are seen as different and other exactly because there is such an affinity here. By writing about conspiracy theorists as religious believers, academics are involved, you could say, in professional boundary work, which Deering calls boundary work, and the practices of purification. This practice reinforces the modern divide between rational science and its alleged irrational counterparts by actively downplaying the similarities and blowing up the differences between both discourses. Statements about conspiracy theories from this perspective do not necessarily say something about conspiracy theorists, but more about social scientists who are guarding, consolidating, and legitimating their or the monopoly on truth. This protection of the bastions of science and the practice of boundary work is in itself, of course, not new. However, it becomes particularly relevant, is the argument, in contemporary society, where the epistemic authority of science is increasingly contested. There are a lot of empirical studies on that, like, for instance, the one done by Ronald Inglehart, who made a big study in comparing different countries in quantitative research in different surveys. And his argument is indeed that there is a growing skepticism among Western citizens towards scientific authorities, the knowledge they produce and the technical solutions they propose. Based on this survey, he, and I quote, concludes that a diminishing confidence that science and technology will help solve humanity's problems has advanced farthest in economically and technologically most advanced societies. And so in that sense, you could say the distrust of science and scientific experts and the knowledge they produce is the biggest, if we follow Inglehart, in those countries that we consider generally the modern or high modern or late modern or postmodern countries. Obviously, this erosion of trust in scientific knowledge does not extinguish the will to truth. Outside scientific institutions, alternative truth claims are actively developed, and regular and alternative theories are increasingly competing. Established science lost its monopoly on truth, but this, at the same time, opens up a market for experts producing knowledge that is often, as we have seen, labeled as unscientific, irrational, or dangerous by regular scientists, but it is nevertheless massively embraced by late modern citizens. It is this cultural climate of epistemological insecurity that promotes the flowering of conspiracy theories in the West. But, and this brings me to the second point of my story. I have a little bit more time, right? I mean, because we didn't start at 5 o'clock exactly. This is the second half of my story here. Does this mean that conspiracy narratives only feature rationality, skepticism, critical thinking? Does it mean that conspiracy theories have nothing to do with religion or spirituality, as many conspiracy theorists and their defenders would argue? These assumptions are also hard to maintain, I would argue. In the X-Files, Mulder and Scully developed the series The X-Files that were quite popular in the 1990s, developed theories about possible relations between phenomena, test hypotheses, and try to rationally explain seemingly inexplicable and mysterious events. While encountering very supernatural and mysterious agents in a network of conspiracies, they remain true to the scientific method of inquiry. In line with the analysis, in this presentation they are skeptics and critical thinkers. This is, however, only one side of the story. Mulder's motto, "I want to believe," featured in the X-Files movie of 2008, exemplifies a modern tension between belief and non-belief, the secular and the religious, rationality and enchantment. That is, I would argue, at the heart of contemporary conspiracy culture. let's give a little bit of a sort of sociological context, a little bit of sociological background to this whole urge of I want to believe here. Because it's a truism in sociology, and particularly the sociology of religion, that belief has become utterly problematic in modern societies. Max Weber famously wrote about a disenchantment of the world, a long-standing process in the West that eroded mysterious accounts, religious accounts, magical accounts of nature. And it eradicated magic and ultimately the belief in every metaphysical Hinterwelt that once provided the Western world with solid meaning. This is, Weber argued, which is always quite ambivalent about these modern developments. This is the tragic dimension of modernity. And on the one hand, we have more knowledge about what the world is, and we have, say, more effective forms of governance, but at the same time this leads to problems of meaning. Science describes the world as it is, but can by its very nature say nothing about what the world's processes really mean. And it can and should be silent about what the meaning of life actually is. There are many, of course, many examples that you can give. Medical science can extend our lives and can make us better, more so than, say, 100 years ago. But it can say nothing about what the meaning of this life is, which is one of the examples that Max Weber used. More than that, medical science, neurobiology, astronomy, evolution theory, and other disciplines actively contribute to the idea that there is no essential, inherent meaning to the world. The intellectual imperative to pursue the truth, and nothing but the truth, thus contributes to a world devoid of existential meaning. A world in which, and I quote him in English, processes simply are and happen, but no longer signify anything. Peter Berger and other authors, they comment in their book The Homeless Mind on the existential implications of this development of disenchantment. Modern man, they argued, has suffered from a deepening condition of homelessness, a metaphysical loss of home. They were many advocates of secularization, who followed very much this disenchantment theory. I mean, there's a whole debate, of course, what is the difference between disenchantment and secularization, but they proved to have a sort of serious blind spot for the fact that exactly these problems of meaning invoke the rise of new forms of religion, spirituality, and re-enchantment. And it's interesting, I mean, if you read Weber, that even in his own times, whereas he was the one proclaiming and talking about the disenchantment of the world, in his time, at the beginning of the 20th century, many of his fellow intellectuals took refuge in alternative religions and spiritualities, like Steiner's anthroposophy or Blavatsky's new theosophy, romantic transcendentalism, or spiritism for that matter. This turn towards, well, more esoterical or non-institutionalized spirituality outside the traditional, basically Christian churches has only increased over the last century. Since the 1960s, Thomas Luckman argued, Christianity has lost its monopoly on religion in the West. But this did not result in a secular, disenchanted society. More than that, it opened up what he calls a market of ultimate significance, where those who want to believe behave basically like religious consumers. On the basis of what he calls bricolage, which is, of course, a concept that he uses a lot, of different religious traditions, like, I mean, it doesn't matter, like Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, esotericism, occultism, there's a whole sort of market where people tap into. They construct their own private form of religiosity, their own private system of ultimate significance, he argues. In a similar vein, conspiracy theorists are involved in relentless bricolage. I mean, and if we're talking about this growth of spirituality, just as an aside, and this is a sort of theoretical element to it, a lot of my own research is very much about this sort of a compensation theory hypothesis, that indeed where the Christian churches run empty, particularly in those countries, you'll find a sort of substitution in the spiritual scene. And we did a sort of quantitative research where we compared different countries, and what we found is particularly in those countries, like for instance the Netherlands, but also Scandinavian countries and France, where the churches run empty the quickest. You'll find the more interest in spirituality than in these real religious Christian countries like Portugal or Greece, for that matter. So there's a lot of empirical evidence of also that we are increasingly seeing this interest in spirituality. Conspiracy theories are involved in relentless bricolage also of scientific and spiritual accounts in what Colin Campbell called the cultic milieu. It is not surprising that in our recent survey in the Netherlands, which we did, which is one element of the survey that I presented here, we did find a very strong, significant correlation between believing in all kinds of spiritual New Age assumptions. Like, for instance, believing in the holistic union of mind and body, and all kinds of other ideas that the spirit is all in the world and not outside the world. So there's an explicit correlation between believing in spiritual New Age assumptions and conspiracy theories. Many theorists in the milieu explicitly combine both discourse and then are involved in New Age conspiracism, as Barkun would say. Or there's this article of Ward and Voas from 2011, or in conspirituality, as he calls that. Probably pure types of spiritual teachers like Eckhart Tolle, James Redfield, or Louis Hay will reproach conspiracy theorists for being too negative and pessimistic, and vice versa. Conspiracy theorists will feel the former is overly positive, naive, and blind to the dark underbelly of the world. The growing sort of middle ground here, position of conspirituality, Ward and Voas explain, appears to be a means by which political cynicism is tempered with spiritual optimism. David Icke, who is indeed exposing the dream world we believe to be real, is again an outstanding example of this. On the one hand, his theories delve into the dark and paranoid issues, like the death of bin Laden and other lies, the fascist bloodline network, shape-shifting alien lizards, global conspiracies, mind programming, brainwashing, and mass hypnosis. While it taps, on the other hand, in typical New Age themes like astrology, healing, infinite love, and spiritual awakening. So, taking the step in between, we might rightly argue that this bricolage in the cultic milieu, combining spiritual and conspirational discourses, does not inform us much about how ultimate meaning is then actually constructed. According to Weber, every religion has its own particular theodicy of good and evil, a grand narrative, so to speak, that explains the ultimate meaning of the world, the suffering in the world, and as such promises spiritual salvation. To illustrate what spiritual meanings are attributed to the world by conspiracy theorists, I will discuss three statements that are, according to Michael Barkun, at the core of the conspirational discourse and reverses, in that sense, the sort of Weberian disenchantment of the world. I gotta get to my PowerPoint again. There are not a lot of images, not a lot of text, but I thought I'd keep it simple. So, the first assumption here is that both spiritual believers and conspiracy theorists relate to the statement, "Nothing is what it seems." This statement, like the others to follow, is embraced by both groups, but simultaneously have a radical different meaning. New Age participants locate mysterious forces in the natural world, in human bodies, the earth, and the universe as a whole. Nature is considered sacred in the spiritual milieu. It contains an overpowering yet invisible force of energy that permeates everything in the cosmos. Conspiracy theorists relocate, you could say, such mysterious forces from nature to modern society. Invisible, yet immensely powerful forces are operative behind the cultural screens, underneath and beyond the empirical surface of modern life. Reality is always a staged reality that conceals the awful truth that evil agents are de facto controlling our lives. This paranoid logic is very well illustrated, I think, in the movies like The Truman Show or Existence by David Cronenberg, or The Matrix, which is obviously the sort of classic blockbuster that is playing with these kind of ideas. In The Matrix, the protagonist, Neo, finds basically out that the reality as we experience is not a real reality, but basically a virtual world constructed by alien artificial intelligences who try to alienate, in that sense, in a quite literal sense, the individual citizens. So this is very much a sort of a paranoid, a conspirational scheme where nothing is what it seems, but behind the cultural screens there are overpowering energies and forces. In this case, that is artificial intelligences. In the case of the film of Peter Weir, this is the media, because he finds out that he's living in a big media show, in a reality show, so to speak. So this is basically the first statement here. There is always a sort of power, a sort of energy, a higher force behind the cultural scheme. The second statement is nothing happens by accident. Spiritual seekers generally resist the modern assumption that the natural world is essentially devoid of meaning, direction and intention. As such, they withdraw from findings and assertions in the natural sciences. The process of evolution, for instance, is nowadays typically understood by biologists as governed by contingency. Human existence from this perspective is a lucky accident. New Agers, or spiritual seekers, maintain that evolution is motivated by a spiritual logic that unfolds throughout history and moves towards a higher spiritual goal in the future. This is the new age of light, peace and stability. Interestingly, it is often argued in the milieu that the universe conspires towards humans in a good and constructive way. There is a positive cosmic intention that is in this milieu, which is interesting, I think, called pronoia, as the positive counterpart of paranoia. At a more mundane level, this means, obviously, that curious accidents should not be understood as accidental and should essentially be read as what Carl Gustav Jung calls, and there's a lot of influence of Carl Gustav Jung within the spiritual milieu, he calls that synchronicity, or a non-causal and meaningful coincidence. In the narratives of conspiracy theorists, similar assumptions are made, but they do not apply to nature, but again to modern institutions. Whether we are talking about the attacks of 9/11, the assassination of JFK in 1963, or the accident of Princess Diana, conspiracy theorists believe that nothing happens by accident, just like spiritual seekers. They seek intentions where others would find coincidence, randomness and contingency. They detect structure where others see chaos. They find meaning where others do not. Every detail may be part and parcel of a grand scheme or plot. Conspiracy implies a world based on intentionality, from which accident and coincidence have removed. Anything that happens, of course, because it has been willed. Finally, there is the third trope, which is the slogan, everything is connected. A statement that again constitutes much of the discourse of spiritual seekers and conspiracy theorists. Spiritual seekers relate this statement to the natural world. It is an expression of their holistic worldview, in which modern dualism is basically rejected and the alleged connections between God and humans, nature and man, body and spirit, is restored. Among conspiracy theorists, the statement that everything is connected means that there are countless social connections and coalitions that in the end make up a global network of power. The truth is out there, yet always just out of sight. And it is hence no surprise that conspiracy theorists relentlessly weave new, ever-expanding grand narratives about possible connections to reveal this awful truth. If we take these three discursive strategies of meaning-making into account, it becomes quite difficult to deny that there is an affinity between religion and conspiracy theories. In the sociology of religion, there are basically, and this is a big conflict for years, you could say, I would say these are complementary definitions, but there are two definitions of religion, basically that apply to the phenomenon I'm studying here. On the one hand, there's the, classical, ordinary, substantial definition that focuses basically on what religion is. Religious discourses always refer to a transcendent God, a supernatural being, or a supra-empirical higher force that has strong influence on everyday lives. This force, in turn, invokes religious feelings of awe, a typical combinations of fear and fascination. This is the idea of merit. Given the assumptions about an invisible, overpowering and controlling force in conspiracy theories, we may conclude that it aligns with a substantial definition. But on the other hand, sociologists of religion, like, which is a sociology of culture, but people like Robert Bellah, Peter Burge and Thomas Luckman, do not so much look at what religion is, but what it does, the meaning it ultimately generates. These scholars use a functional definition. Religion is considered an anthropological condition of man, since human beings can only find ultimate meaning in realities that transcend their individual existence. Secularization, from this perspective, is always a self-limiting process. Humans are incurably religious. The will to believe, in other words, is not easy to erase in human societies. Guided by this perspective, various studies have demonstrated the continuation of religion in seemingly secular social phenomena. Civic religions based on state-supported rituals like raising the national flag or singing the national anthem are one example. The collective fascination for football, sports and celebrities provides another example. But from this functional definition, believing in conspiracies may provide yet another example. Such assertions do not only situate invisible, forceful powers in modern society, but in doing so generate ultimate meaning and reverse the disenchantment of the world. To paraphrase the statement of Weber that I was quoting earlier, they assert that the world is essentially not as it is. Processes do not simply happen, but do in fact signify something. So this brings us back to where we started in the introduction of my presentation. Indeed, academics compare conspiracy theories often with religion, but generally argue that there are the remains of an outdated pre-modern worldview. Karl Popper, leading the way here, argued that they should be seen as illusions, as secularized forms of superstition. The terminology in itself already conveys that these are not descriptions grounded in empirical research. They are generalizations and moral labels used to dismiss conspiracy theories as irrational illusions and legitimate the rational scientific worldview. Instead of taking part in this kind of professional boundary work, I argue social scientists should better focus on the complexity of the discourse and the ultimate meaning it has for those who adhere to it. So again, this is a sort of cultural sociological element to it. So concluding within a minute. In this presentation, what I did was I tried to basically develop two related arguments as a sort of summary. First of all, I argued that academic descriptions of conspiracy theories as a symptom of paranoia, bad science or religious belief on the one hand, and claims of scientific rationality made by conspiracy theorists on the other, are in fact moral labels. Such labels say nothing about the phenomenon itself, but reveal a lot about the position of both groups in a wider field of knowledge production. This is basically the central approach of a lot of the research that we're doing, a research project on conspiracy culture in the Netherlands. They indicate basically a power struggle for truth in a cultural climate of epistemological insecurity. Maybe more than ever, the epistemic authority of science is contested, and hence the latter has to draw clear-cut boundaries between good science and bad science, between legitimate methods and false methods, real scientists and charlatans, between us basically and them, us moderns and those pre-moderns. In doing so, ironically, academics do what they reproach conspiracy theorists to do. Instead of empirically studying conspiracy theories, the discourses and their meanings for people, they take an essentialistic or even sometimes fundamentalistic moral position. And you could say it remains to be seen how open these academics are about falsifying their truth claims. The second related argument is that this othering obscures the hybrid character of the conspiracy discourse. Conspiracies are neither expressions of secular skepticism, as the theorists would have it, but neither can and should they be reduced to religion, as academics would have it. they obviously tap into both discourses. Conspiracy theories function as a religion for atheists, a form of rational enchantment. And to be sure, by using such concepts, I do not in any way intend to reify conspiracy culture once again. It is an inherent, unstable, multi-faced phenomenon where groups and individuals relentlessly construct their own narratives, like in the bricolage kind of fashion. In these constructions, is my point, they oscillate between the poles of secular skepticism and spiritual meaning. Two domains, you could say, that are still radically opposed in the modern mindset and by and large escape academic attention. In much of his work, finally, Bruno Latour has shown that such, what he calls sort of hybrids or in-between categories, have always haunted the modern divide between science and religion that was constructed by the moral political project of the Enlightenment. Increasingly, he argues, hybrids such as these, but also all kinds of other hybrids between objects and subjects and nature and culture, are increasingly acknowledged and visible in the public sphere. And quoting him, he argues, our own, well, let's see, there's something going wrong here. Oh yeah. Our own modern mythology consists in, it's mythology in the sense that he said, well, it's not a sort of ontological distinction between science and religion, for instance, or objects and subjects. It's always a political construct here. So it is hence, according to Latour, a mythology. The mythology consists in imagining ourselves as a radically different. And as soon as the great divide, as he calls it, disappears, the mythology unravels as well. Conspiracy theories from this perspective do not only defy the distinction between a secular or religious position, and this is the sort of, the implication, I think, for the sociology of religion. Their popularity problematizes all too bold sociological claims about a progressive secularization or, on the other hand, a desecularization. I mean, this is a debate that is going on almost for 20 years now. And there are many names I can drop here, but this is a big debate. Or the disenchantment and re-enchantment of modern society. Instead of endlessly debating the validity of one of these theories, as is done by sociologists of religion, we should, I suppose, study the ways these cultural processes develop in tandem. Conspiracy culture, I hope to have demonstrated here, is an excellent case study to start with such a research project. So that is basically my conclusion.
Thank you. I'm going to do a brief.
Yes.
You want me to sit here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh, can I?
Yeah. Just a brief one, and then we'll do that.
Just so, yes, just a brief comment, and I didn't see the conclusion in advance, so obviously you can all comment on that. But I really like the approach. I like the approach of analysing conspiracy theories in terms of a discursive struggle for epistemic authority. Authority as the right to make claims and be believed. And I think a significant aspect of modern conspiracy theories is that they seem to involve such challenges. They seem to be part of the struggle over power to make believable claims about reality. And I think that's a really nice move. And as you argue in the paper, however, the way in which conspiracy theories present this challenge to epistemic authority is kind of peculiar, because it seems to draw on both skepticism and credulity. So doubt in an official narrative, but also positive belief, a positive affirmation of a specific alternative. And in the interest of time, I'll skip my example of climate change to illustrate this. But basically, denialists and skeptics are the two labels that get struggled over, as one is a legitimate rational critic and the other is the irrational firm believer. And I think you're right to focus on this peculiar relationship, but it raises for me a sort of conceptual question. Right? What does it mean to believe a conspiracy theory? And you say in your survey at the beginning, in reference to some of this, that we can infer from the survey that they believe that the US did it to themselves or something, or that at least they think it's plausible. And we'd have to dig a little deeper to find out exactly what they're doing when they tick that box on the survey. But I do have a worry in a sense that I think that one reason so many people resist the label of a conspiracy theorist is that there's a world of difference between believing in, which is to say positively affirming a particular substantive account of some event or phenomenon, and simply doubting an official narrative. Lots of people doubt an official narrative with more or less good reasons, but not many people would sign on to some of the particular beliefs. And conspiracy theorists necessarily doubt the official narrative, right? But not everyone who doubts the official narrative is a conspiracy theorist. So we often have precisely this sort of skeptics, denialists, sort of, that boundary there is one of the awkward ones. And this leads me to one question about your empirical study, which is basically, how did you identify conspiracy theorists? Because you report they say things like, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. So how did you determine that they were? You know, and that they were therefore part of the set of things to be studied in this case? So that's one group of questions, and just skipping over this. The other thing I liked about your paper was how you put it you put the conspiracy theory problem squarely in the sort of as a problem of, or the analysis of conspiracy theories as a problem of boundary work, right? Of observing the ways in which those who would claim to be privileged interpreters and explainers of society kind of. Sorry? Oh, you want some paper? Yeah. You know, how conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theories are not just out there, rather they are constructed by professionals, academics, or that was your claim, I think, academics in the process of protecting the boundaries of their socially recognized expertise. So my question here is, who exactly is doing this boundary work? You know, is it really the social theorists? And I'm very sympathetic to your argument about the parallels between critical sociology and constructivist sociology and conspiracy theorists, but they, to my mind, don't seem to be the ones who are doing most of the othering. So who is it? You know, is it other academics? Is it psychologists? Is it worth differentiating who is actually doing the boundary work here? And particularly the media, right? Not academics at all. There's relatively little academic attention been paid to conspiracy theories. So, yeah, and I mean, the final comment I had was simply that one that kind of interests me. It's this relationship between skepticism and credulity itself. Like, there's a nice comment that Alexis de Tocqueville makes in Democracy in America, where he says that under the social condition of equality, which is more or less what he meant by a democratic society, people are not disposed to trust the authority of any man. He said, his Americans, they refuse to defer to men of learning, or to traditional religious authorities, or to political elites. But it's not like they were Kantian Enlightenment superheroes having the courage to use their own reason. He just said, under these conditions of equality, men, you know, turn away from elites for the sources of truth, but they turn towards others like them, and that they then sort of exchange one sort of intellectual authority for another. And that, to me, I mean, it's not so much a question for you, it's a question for me. I'm thinking, you know, that this relationship between intellectual independence, perhaps, as people like John Stuart Mill have argued, requiring dependence on authorities, requiring trust in authorities. And so I think it's interesting in the framework of your whole paper how you nicely connect the sort of, that, you know, or you sort of get to this idea that credulity can be linked to the rational skepticism. Anyway, that's more than enough from me. So thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you very much.